Yes, my name is Steve Szeghi. I'm professor of economics at Wilmington College in Wilmington, Ohio. And my key interests are ecological economics and the economies of indigenous peoples, and also the whole issue of social justice and equality between people. So those are my subfields within economics, what I like to write about and speak about whenever I get the opportunity. In addition, I teach all the standard economics courses at my school, the micro, macro theory, history of economic thought, comparative economic systems, money and banking, the whole slew of courses. It's a very small teaching college, liberal arts college. The greatest global threat? Well, I guess I've been thinking about that during my time here at this conference so far, and sometimes lately I just feel very, very sad because I'm afraid that people can get used to the idea of a world without wilderness and a world without wildlife. I'm afraid that people can adapt to that idea, and it's going to be much to our great peril and suffering, because I think without wilderness and without wildlife, and we're kind of at a tripping point here in terms of preserving critical habitat, in terms of protecting wildlife corridors, and also in terms of doing something about climate change. It's like we're running out of time, and if we don't do something geopolitically on a global level to restructure our institutions that govern international trade, and also laws and regulations to protect these species, then I think we are headed for a world without wilderness, without wildlife. And it's going to be really, really sad, because that's not the type of world I want to pass on to my grandchildren. I have two recent grandsons, and one is 6 months old and one's about 5 months old. And I'd like them to see grizzly bears when they're my age. I'd like them to have that experience to pass on to their children. I'd like them to see wolves and an abundance of the different species of whales and tigers and lions and elephants. And there's just so many threats to wildlife. And I'm afraid sometimes that people are so mesmerized by consumerism. At the first session today, and actually, no, it was last night, Dr. Yakunin brought up that quote from J.C. Kapoor about how the global economy has just become this unlimited consumerism protected by military might. And it's like this unlimited consumerism is like the opium of the masses that dulls people to reality. And I'm afraid with all that consumerism, people could potentially get used to a world without wilderness and wildlife. But like I said, it would be to our peril as human beings, because I think we need wilderness. We need wildlife to really stay in touch with who we truly are as human beings. On top of that, it's just profoundly wrong. It's profoundly immoral, unethical for one species to squeeze out so much of the rest of nature.
Lack of biodiversity. So when nations won't address these issues, how can individuals make a difference?
How can individuals make a difference when nations aren't acting, and when there isn't a global structure dealing with these issues? Well, it's actually limited what individuals can do, but what individuals can do by example is to kind of create the pressures that are needed for nations and eventually the globe to change. So That's how I see the voluntary actions of individuals. By themselves, they aren't enough, okay? But what they can do is to ultimately build a wave of support for the type of changes we need to make at the political and collective level. And I mean, in the meantime, it's not as though they don't do any good. But I think one thing that individuals could potentially do that could have a dramatic effect, really, particularly on the whole climate change front, is when we're talking about Westerners, people in Western Europe, in Canada, the United States, Australia. If we're talking about meat eaters, for example, and I'm not an expert with the physical sciences, but my colleagues do tell me that roughly about half of the ecological footprint of a meat eater is from eating meat. So, changing to a vegetarian diet or to a diet of just some reduced meat consumption is something that any individual could do just like that, okay? So much of what else you have to do to reduce your ecological footprint depends on either having financial investment where you put solar panels on your house, or alternatively you stop driving your car so much and take public transport. But that demands that there's public transport to be taken, and that involves a collective decision again. So one thing that every individual could do right away to reduce substantially their ecological footprint is to reduce meat consumption, because if the whole globe adopts a Western-style meat diet, I mean, we're basically dooming wilderness and wildlife, and probably we're ultimately dooming our own species as well. So, but that's half of the ecological footprint. But then you also do have to deal with public transport, and so we need to find ways to tap the creativity and dynamism of individuals in terms of actions maybe they're taking as examples to others, but the ultimate goal is to build support for collective decisions and structural change at both the national and global level. Yes, I do believe that we should do a lot more to limit the power of corporations by law and by regulations. And one of the ways we do that is by restructuring the rules of the game when it comes to international trade. The global prices that things sell for doesn't incorporate in those prices their full cost. It doesn't incorporate the cost to communities of factories shutting down and moving other places. It doesn't incorporate the full cost to the environment. It doesn't incorporate the cost to workers' health of poor working conditions or substandard wages. So international prices have to be redone in a way that builds into them what we in economics call negative externalities. So if there's an additional cost to that goods production that company isn't paying for, be it the workers' health, environmental costs, cost to communities, they have to be taxed appropriately to cover those costs. And what I'm telling you here is just standard economics. This isn't any, wild, crazy theory that hasn't been thoroughly vetted in the economics textbooks. It's like standard theory. Externalities, markets don't work. And we would actually be making the market work better if we made corporations pay the full cost of what they're producing. So We got to start with that. Okay. Beyond that, there's issues involving the ability of corporations to impact the whole entire political process. And one of the
Speaking in the United States.
I'm
especially.
speaking in the United States, but also, internationally as well. Uh, when it comes to corporate power, we have countries all over the globe in a race to the bottom, and they're competing, governments are competing against other governments, seeing who can cut the taxes on corporations more, who can cut regulations and laws on corporations more, and the countries that are the most lax, this is where these corporations are moving to. We need international agreements between governments to stop this ridiculous race to the bottom, that we're not going to compete with one another on that level. I mean, this is a very, very destructive race to the bottom where countries don't have, therefore, the revenue to fund social safety nets. They don't have the revenue to protect the environment. They don't have the revenue for merit goods for such as education for people, and it just has to stop. We've had several decades of this race to the bottom now, and I can't see it doing any good. But on the one hand, it might be wishful thinking, saying we can do this, but I think people in governments across the globe recognize that this course that the entire planet is on is very, very dangerous, and it's absolutely necessary to rein in corporate power in the United States, but also throughout the world. Well, this is the thing. If I believe that if we raise the way to raise living standards in the third world is not to allow corporations to go to the third world to harvest labor and resources cheaply without the full cost being considered. And when corporations do that, when they go and do that, go to another country and exploit workers or exploit nature, if they're bound by international agreements that they got to pay those extra costs in the price, well, then what then happens is you're going to raise those living standards in the third world, because when they go there, it's like, okay, well, we're going to have to pay for it one way or the other. Either, we're going to have to pay this tax to some sort of global entity. It would have to be some sort of global institution newly created, or alternatively, we can just pay the workers better, or we can be more environmentally proper and ecologically conscious in what we do. That way we don't pay the tax. So we're going to wind up paying the full costs anyway. So what that would in essence do is not give a competitive advantage to the exploiters of labor or the exploiters of the environment.